and welcome back to post-game content. As ever, I'm your host Max, joined by my co-host Michael. How you doing today, Michael?
Well,
boy, that was a loaded pause.
You know what? Don't ask loaded questions if you don't want loaded answers.
Starting out with a bang off a hiatus.
Yeah, it's listen, there's been some stuff happen, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Between probably the most loaded 3 months of my life in terms of events, but also the most loaded 3 months of video games that's ever existed. My attention has been torn a lot of different places, and a lot of internal conflicts, a lot of external conflicts. It's just been a roller coaster. So, how about you, Max? How are you?
God, less as busy as you have been, but you're right. It's been a sort of a crazy 3 months for video games and stuff, and there's been a lot of releases that I've played a lot of and have a lot of thoughts about, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, that
probably
is
the first thing. First thing we should address is where the fuck have we been for a while?
Yeah, so if you're in the Discord community, you'll probably have seen some of the updates. So some of this might not be news to everyone, but for those of you who are just casually tune in, don't partake in the Discord. Max and myself did convene to record an episode, and actually one that a lot of people probably saw or were expecting, I should say, on Resident Evil 4. And we discussed the old game, the new game, the remake, the comparisons of that game to, the other horror remake that came out this year, Dead Space. And quite frankly, it was a great discussion. It probably didn't head in the direction that a lot of people thought it would have. But after a robust 3-hour conversation,
so long,
closing things out, there was a harrowing silence from Max's end where we came to the realization that the audio did not record. So, for those of you who don't,
it just recorded silence.
That's which, fair. Yeah,
is arguably preferable to a lot of my takes anyway.
Yeah, for sure. But I guess the moral of the story is, for those of you who don't know, Max and I do not record in the same room together. We are probably close to 350 miles apart. And we do our episodes over a Discord call, and just lucky that I've been in podcasting for 6-7 years now, and we can mash it together to sound like we are right next to each other. So
big reveal that Michael and I don't live together.
Contrary to popular belief, we are not in a relationship.
Yes, and thank you for all the fan art you keep sending in. That's been great.
Don't stop.
Please don't stop.
But yeah, so that's kind of where we have been. There's been some other life events, and that's probably that we recorded that episode in April, so that explains the April absence. And in May, and beyond, there's been family events from my end. Max is a married man now.
I got married.
So you can imagine that at the culmination of all of those things, both Max and I were pretty disheartened about the episode of the Resident Evil episode. Family events. I still have some personal stuff going on that's been eating up a lot of my time. And yeah, so that's kind of where we've been in the absence there. So I'm sorry, but life happens. But I don't want anyone to think that we're taking a break because we weren't interested in the show or anything like that. It was just purely time got ahead of us, and just some unfortunate mishaps. So
this is the first time I think after a long absence that I'm not going to say fuck you to the audience. This one was mostly on my end, and you are allowed to say fuck you to me. So go ahead. That's fair enough. Turnabout is fair play.
Well, yeah, I mean, our Discord community has set a precedence, and I should say our listener community has set a precedence that they have no problem joining the Discord, insulting you, and then immediately leaving. So
Which is, yeah, that's a good way to interact with that.
that was too good, too good, too good.
So,
yeah,
Michael, in this tumultuous time, when obviously you've had to balance a lot of things, and in the, few moments that you have to yourself, what have you been playing?
well, it's no secret that this has been the most stacked couple months of gaming, like in a long time. We are eating good in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a new Zelda game come out, and
did we?
Yeah, I think it's called Tears of the Kingdom, but it should have been called Breath of the Wild expansion Tears of the Kingdom.
Is it a new Zelda game, Michael?
Yeah, so that's the hot button topic, and I've been on and off with the game since it launched. I think I probably have close to like 80 to 90 hours in it, but a lot of that's like idle time where I'll press pause and like walk away from my system and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to talk about this for a second, because like I'd be willing to bet that like 80 to 90% of our audience has probably played this game.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I just in a few sentences, Tears of the Kingdom is a marvel that it works on the platform that it does.
Agreed.
On an underpowered platform, there is a billion things that you can do. The physics engine is absolutely flawless. Just a remarkable improvement on Breath of the Wild in just about every way. That being said, it is literally just an improvement on Breath of the Wild.
Yeah. Well, what I find a little bit disheartening about it is that it doesn't fix any of the problems that Breath of the Wild had, and doubles down on a lot of stuff about Breath of the Wild that I didn't necessarily enjoy. Mm-hmm. I'm not even necessarily saying that to be like, oh, this game sucks. It just means that, like, I don't know, it's doing a lot of shit that isn't for me, and is not generally things that I associate with a Zelda game. Yeah. I like you were saying, I think it's a marvel that it works, and the ultra hand ability, the basically like physics mechanic is a wonder. It really is phenomenal. I don't like it at all, but it's phenomenal.
Yeah, the game forces you to do a lot of. It says here you have this creative sandbox to build things and do whatever you want to do to accomplish your goal. And the problem is, I don't want to do those. It's not that I don't want to use the ultra hand. I don't want to do what it's telling me I have to do, like at all. I don't want to build. I don't want all like the side missions or finding some creative way to use these new abilities. And it's like, I never had this in another game. But the problem is that Breath of the Wild sold the most out of like any Zelda game ever. So they're going to stick to that. And they've said that this is the formula moving forward. So, yeah, it's pretty disheartening, to say the least. Not to say I'm not like absolutely loving Tears of the Kingdom. I just think there's room in the Nintendo community for another type of Zelda game. And like you can have your 3D dungeon-esque, like I guess the best way to say it would just be like linear Zelda games. You can have your 2D Zelda games, or 3D top-down, whatever, and you can have your open world games, and they could exist in harmony without having to discount the idea of dungeons. So
I think, and I know I say this a lot, but I think Metroid is a pretty good example of how to do this, where there should be a split like we're seeing right now between the Prime games and the mainline Metroid series.
Wait, there are Prime games?
Cast your minds back. The year is 2006. You're still excited about owning a Nintendo Wii.
Oh man.
But yeah, that's the kind of split that I think would benefit Zelda at this point, I think. And I understand that's selfish because effectively what I'm saying is like, what if there was a game for literally 98% of the population who love it to death, and also a game for me, Max? Like,
I don't know. I feel like well, here's the thing. Think about it this way. People out there widely consider the latest 2D/3D entry, top-down entry, Link Between Worlds to be one of the better entries in the Zelda franchise, and I agree, it's fantastic.
mhm.
But there's room for that. So,
Yeah,
and a lot of people would say, no, I don't want them to go away from making things like that. And I think there's just as an equally large number of the community that would say, oh my God, I love Breath of the Wild. I love Tears of the Kingdom, but I also love Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, and think that, the item based dungeon mechanics that they have created are very much, they have a place in the Zelda universe, as opposed to everything being, Link at this point essentially has relied on everyone else to get the job done. All of his abilities in this game are other people's abilities that you
well, yeah,
utilize.
and I think maybe that's the main. You've kind of hit on the crux of it. Is that what I consider to be a Zelda game is like a slow accumulation of new ways to interact with the world around you. And in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, all those tools are given to you up front, outside of like auto build, which is a good improvement. I think that you have to kind of work for that ability. But you know, when you got a hook shot for the first time, it was like you saw things in a whole new world. You had to think about,
Mm-hmm.
verticality, and different ways to traverse. And there isn't any kind of like mid-game aha sort of moment like that in either Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom because it gives you everything up front.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And as much as I want to keep talking about this, we have a whole episode ahead of us, folks.
That's true.
I do want to say the other big release that I've been sinking time into, Diablo 4. Man, it is so good. It feels so good to play. I know you've been playing it too. Do you agree?
Yeah. I was initially super skeptical because it takes a lot of cues from live service games. Like I wouldn't go I don't know, it is technically a live service, always online game, but there's enough like uh mechanical like robustness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm playing as a necromancer and learning how those mechanics like work, and putting together a build has been super gratifying.
Yeah, it is remarkably simple to grasp,
Hmm.
yet incredibly deep. And finding that like perfect balance. One, I think that after the success of Diablo 3, I think that they knew you had a really good framework going into, and just with such a drastic fan base wanting more depth in the mechanics. It's like they took the mechanical depth of 2 and put it into 4, while
Yeah.
keeping the simplistic, oh, you don't want to mess with the in-game meta, cool, you can still play and have a really good time. And that's me.
Yeah.
I don't have time to sit and look up builds and that kind of thing. I just want to play, and it's like, oh, this one has a green number and this one has a red number, I'm gonna slot the green one. Like, that's me. Sorry, guys.
That's
I'm
fair.
the idiot.
Shit like that kind of rules because like even if that's a mistake, it's not going to matter in 10 minutes, right? Because all of that
Exactly.
stuff that you're owned will be gone anyway.
My arm pump for the legendary that I got on a kill, it doesn't matter, because in 10 minutes I'll replace it with a common item that just has better stats.
Right. Well, it gets me two plus damage. So bye.
Yeah, sorry. But yeah, so like that's just scratching the surface of what's really been going on, in the gaming community. I went back to Dead Space. I've been slowly working myself up to playing through an impossible run.
A no kill run or no death run.
No death run, yeah. So I actually started it and I'm in chapter 3. I came
Oh
very
shit.
close to death once already. So a lot of people out there are saying like it's like the death sequences are long. So if you pause and quit, then you have the ability to get out sometimes before it like catches your death.
Oh, if you just alt F4.
Yeah, essentially. So but no, I haven't died yet, so we'll keep the run going, and inevitably whenever I die in the warhead room, I'm going to be really pissed off. So
I was thinking like my first death in that game was in, I think it's chapter 4, whenever you turn the gravity generator back on.
Yeah, that would be so humiliating.
I just ran the wrong way, and like I just pink mist.
Yeah, that's a big thing for this run too. Like, because normally you're just like you're focused on what's ahead of you and trying to like stay on the objective.
Right.
And playing it this way is entirely different. And it actually, I feel like it puts me more in the shoes of Isaac because I'm literally only focused on like what is around me. I'm spending all my money on stasis so that way I can always be able to stop things as they get close to me. And it just changes the way you play the game entirely. It's really cool. So
that's awesome.
But that's my I played another game, Max. I played this little game called What Remains of Edith Finch. Let's just pivot entirely and talk about that game.
I got
the rest of the plans.
You know what? After a 2-month absence, our transition game still fucking strong. Still strong.
Woo!
Yeah.
There's always pain.
There's always pain. That's my ending. All right. So yeah, the game that we decided to cover this month was What Remains of Edith Finch. This game is it's a weird one. It is a walking sim, and it's so heavily narrative based. And this is the first time that you had played it, right?
It is.
Did you know much about it going in?
I really didn't. The only thing that I really knew about this game were two things. One, it was published by Annapurna, and they have an incredible track record for the other games of theirs that I really like. It's always been on my radar. It was just one that I just never got around to. And I knew it was a narrative heavy game that was going to make me feel like shit. So, yeah. So,
and how did your experience in the playthrough? How did that match up with your expectations?
So, I played this game in about one sitting. Like I had to get up and take care of something for an hour or so and came back and finished it up. But all in all, I think I put about 2.5, 3 hours into it and completed it.
That's about
right. The rest of the day I was emotionally devastated. I'll just say that. There's a lot to swallow in this game. Like it's just like from the first steps you take in this game, it's like a very intriguing mystery but like not a mystery, because like as what I like most about this game, and I know we'll jump into it, but like at the beginning of the game, you are trying to figure out what's going on because there's a lot that Edith knows that you don't. And then as you go on, you slowly you come to an intersecting point with Edith later on, and we'll eventually get there. But the journey up to like both the sides of the triangle before you hit the pinnacle with Edith is just remarkable. Like just so awesome. And I really liked it. I highly recommend this for everyone out there. And I guarantee you could find it, like, if not free on some type of bundle, then, for sale for a few bucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is actually a pretty good point. Like, we've talked about this a lot, that any game that we cover on this show is to be considered as a endorsement. This is one of the few where I'd say, like, if you have any interest in this game at all, pause the episode right now and like just play it. Just play it. We'll see you back here in 2-3 hours. Like, because from here on out, we're going to get into spoiler territory, and this is really something you should go into as blind as humanly possible.
Yeah, you can't talk about this game and not spoil it. So, like, just heads up.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true. So, starting with the spoiler territory, just to lay the groundwork a little bit, what Remains of Edith Finch is about a young woman who is wandering through her childhood home and reliving the lives and deaths of her family members. And through the course of that, we get into some serious questions about intergenerational trauma, superstition, genius, depression, and um, I think there's a little bit about unreliable narrators. I think that like each one of these stories, because they're told by different people, kind of forces you to see it through their eyes, and that can color things to a certain extent.
It's a great
Um,
point. That is a really good point.
it's something that I really noticed the second time around, and really, what that does is make me question like we're seeing this story, in the same way that Edith reads these journals and sort of envisions like, all of her different family members. That's how we're seeing Edith's story too, is through her son who's reading her journal, which means
Hmm.
that her interactions with the house are all kind of through her perspective.
Hmm.
Um, so was there out of all of these, was there a story that kind of like jumped out to you? Like a family member sort of experience that was immediately like, oh shit.
Um, I think the one that I don't want to use the word hit me the hardest because that's I thought about that and then it kind of the pun is too strong.
Is I think I know where we're going here.
Yeah, I don't remember his name off the top of my head. I would need to look at the list of the names of the people. But essentially the one that lived in the basement for 30 some years.
Walter.
That man that got me good. Like
Yeah.
the symbolism in that story is incredible. But I did before we like jump into I just want to talk about like the beginning of this game.
Oh yeah.
Like a game's first impressions really mean a lot. Like
Mm.
because they obviously, I'm stating the obvious, but they just set up the expectations for the remainder of the game and how you're going to experience things. And whenever it starts, like the gate closes behind you and like the world kind of fades in around you and you're standing in the middle of this like big forest and it's like it's quiet, the wind's blowing, you can hear the leaves crackling and then like words start like forming on different parts of the environment and it is like especially after knowing the ending of this little game it is just so incredible because you are connecting like I talked about this the the triangle is like the best way to talk about this game because like if there are 3 points in the triangle, 1 point being Edith, 1 point being the player, and 1 point being the child. They all connect at different points, and they all, as they move closer to one another, will move further away. But the other one's moving closer to you, and it feels so strong. So I guess what I'm saying is the way that this game presents the literal narrative is such a telling love letter to the narrative itself. Um, Not just in the environments, but how the words scroll in the environments, just how this game is okay with being silent. A lot of games are
Yeah.
not willing to do that, and that was like one of the most striking elements of this game was this game uses the quiet to the narrative and the player or the narrator and the narrative's advantage. And it kind of tricked me at first because I was like, is there like a subtle horror element to this? But I mean, there's a horror subplot, but it
Yeah.
has
I
nothing to
wouldn't
do
call
with
it
the main.
subtle.
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about at all. It just makes the environment more rich. It makes you focus on just what's around you and isolates you in a way that doesn't make you feel overly vulnerable. It makes you feel like just vulnerable enough. And that's a really big um like compounding um plot point I think they try to drive home.
I think that's absolutely true. And I'm glad you brought that up. That feeling of uncanniness, I think, in those first moments in the woods where you're not sure what kind of game this is. And as you approach the house, which has this crazy like silhouette, and it seems, almost surreal. I think that expands even when you get inside. Edith has this line early on where she says like, the house was normal, but there was just too much of it. And I think that's a great way to describe it, where it feels almost like a normal house, but there's too much shit. It's,
Yeah.
everything is so packed and all the rooms are sort of weird.
Yeah. I'm realizing now that we're talking about this, I should have played this game again. And I literally just played it like within the week. But like this very much is a game that you should tackle twice now that I'm thinking about it. If not back to back, just to be able to grasp the entire thing. But yeah, the house itself is like, it's such a foreboding but also welcoming presence in the house.
Yeah.
Like, and I felt that way regardless of the narrative, just the way it's structured and all the weird like tacked on rooms and just all the weird stuff about it. But it very much like tells a story about the family just by the way it stands. And I think it's really powerful. And especially as you climb, to literally climb to the roof in this game, it gets more and more compelling and more disastrous as you go up. So,
Yeah. One of the things I think this game does an incredible job at is having a cast of characters that are super distinct and very well realized, that you feel like you get to know really well, despite them not having a lot of screen time or interacting with our player character at all. And one of the ways that I think it does that is like, how well can you know a person just by going through their stuff, And all of these different rooms have such a character to them that, they really do help you understand the people that lived here. It's just a really, really good design. I almost called it level design, which is not quite what it is.
Yeah. That's one of the, I know we'll get into each of them, but one of the things that I really connected with in this game, and I don't feel like this is something that like, I felt like this was really personal to me, so I'll bring it up. Throughout like the entirety of me playing video games, I've always wondered what it would be like if someone was brave enough to shove like a bunch of different genres of game into one game.
Right.
And while What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't deviate too far from the core mechanic, even as it goes from like story to story, it very much is a different style of game in each place. So as I was moving through each of these stories and experiencing them in just a different type of way, especially the one that works in the fish factory, Lewis, especially that story, like I thought to myself, like, this is what I was looking for.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons this game hit me so hard, was that not only did it do that, it did it well, and it made me feel things that I don't normally feel when I'm playing games. So
yeah, that one in particular, I think, is worth the price of admission, to be honest.
Yes.
Like, if you just play the canning level of this, it's
I love that story because it tackles like so many different things. It tackles family trauma. It tackles what it means to have an active imagination. It tackles being both rewarded for your imagination. It tackles being put down for your thoughts that you have. It tackles struggling with all of those things in just a lot of ways that I think that up till really like Senua's Sacrifice, that people don't want to bring to the forefront in video games,
or aren't sure how to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things that I think is, I don't know, I feel like most people who would play this game can instantly relate to that particular experience. if you can't, God bless, because you've lived a better life than I have. But most of us, I think, have been in a position of having a undemanding, incredibly boring, repetitive job, and there's no like escape from it other than to just sit down and do it.
Mm.
And that sort of play between, you know, I like the fact that you have to balance between this stupid motion with your right hand, which doesn't have like any kind of rhythm to it, so you can't even do like muscle memory. You just kind of have to pay attention while you're playing out this big fantasy story. I thought it was brilliant. I thought that was so well done.
What I liked about that, I agree 100%. What I liked about it is that while there was no like definitive rhythm to it, eventually you do get like just as mindless with it as Lewis is, and you're just like flowing through it and like flicking these fish, and you're like, I don't give a shit about this, like this whole world that I'm like being able to connect with Lewis in that way. And like, oh my God, like it was video games with massive AAA budgets cannot get me to give a shit about their protagonist in their game. And this little tiny narrative story like makes me care about these people that, one, aren't real, and two, like I'm with for like 5 minutes. And
I don't think Lewis has a speaking line, to be honest with you.
He doesn't. Yeah, it's all oh man. And I think the most gut-wrenching part of the Lewis point was that at a certain point, it starts to click with you what's coming and what's going to happen. And especially when you're like in his imagination, when he gets to the end of his journey, you're just like, I don't want to walk up the stairs. Like I don't want to do it. And it makes you wonder, like, if because he was so entrenched in his reality, is that what he was thinking too? Did he know what the end was? But he was so invested in that reality that was the way he had to finish his story that he had to tell.
I think
and that's like it's just so cool to like sit and ponder these things.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. One of the things that I think is kind of a through line throughout all these different stories is a lot of incredibly gifted and creative people that either don't have the outlet that they need, or there's something lacking, and the pursuit of that is ultimately what like drives them ultimately to their untimely death. If you've gotten to this point and you haven't played the game, each of these stories that Edith is reading from her past family members are ultimately about how they die. She's the last remaining member of her family, and so she's gone back through her childhood house to sort of uncover what happened to everybody else.
I think that's what I like most about this game, is that it takes the idea of like the branching paths and the family tree and kind of interjects them into one, because while you're right, it does exactly what you're telling. Each story Edith kind of uses that to represent a different portion of her life and her family. And as these stories are unraveling, she begins to tell her story too, and what happens with the house, because she doesn't tell you those things at the beginning, which is why what I was saying like earlier, you don't feel immediately connected to Edith. But as the stories unfold with her family and she tells you more of her story, you become very curious as to who's Edie? Like, why don't you hear about her? Who are you, Edith? Like, what happened? Why did you leave? Because you said you haven't been back in so long. Like, what? And eventually the story gets around to telling you those things. And what I like most about it is, while there are these like really deeply self-contained little stories, they all help drive why Edith's family did what they did. And while that is very much like a core part of the narrative, it's just as much a subplot to the story that thinking back on it, you think about all these little individual events, you think about the implications of each of them and how it impacts the ultimate outcome of this game. But like, I think it's really easy to forget that the core reason of Edith's why she leaves the house is very important to the story. And I think it's one of the more overlooked portions of this game.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. Um, it kind of just slowly unfolds over time. You know, as you said, you start out wondering, who we are, what this is all about, and slowly those pieces start to fall into place. Um, I I remember being kind of annoyed with Edith when we first started, where I thought she just talked quite a lot, um, and wasn't letting me figure stuff out on my own. Um, and as I understood, like, the frame story that this is her story, and I'm eventually, effectively like tagging along in it. That started to make a lot more sense to me.
Yeah. No, for sure. And that's why I said, like, at the beginning, you get like that really strong sense of disconnect, that triangle effect. And as you're moving up one side of it, Edith is also moving up, and you eventually, come to that like pinnacle point in that triangle. Um, but yeah, I did want to, like, while we're talking about like the beginning still a little bit before we jump into some of these stories. Um, I mentioned before we recorded, but I'll mention it here too. When I played this game, I knew it was very narrative focused, and I wanted to start taking notes about the things that I was seeing. And as I started playing it, I realized that I was pausing a lot and stopping at places and looking at things like in like a very investigative type workflow, and it very much felt like I was working. So I just stopped that. But I did take some notes towards the beginning, which I think it's really interesting that like some of the things that I was able to pick out. I have one of my notes here was like, Edith mentions there's a dragon in the pond that killed Edie's husband, and it looks like a slide of some sort. And just like little tiny things like that, that when you come to find out like exactly what happens, my notes are riddled with like these little tiny things that like the missing posters for Milton that were all over the ground, the family tree in the pause menu that has like, it looks like a bunch of people died very young, and I was like, this is going to be a moving game. And there's a lot of like red herrings that the game throws at you, like the Bigfoot posters on the wall. Like I was like, maybe it is a horror game. The Silence in the Forest. Like I just didn't know what to think. And I think that the game does that intentionally because, while Edith knows that like she's not in any danger here, the real crux of the story here is that Edith feels at all times that she's in danger. There's this thing that's like following her. And as I was moving, or I should say more like oppressing her, and as I was moving through this game, there was always something that I would read or see that like I didn't understand. And I would feel like, is this like a danger? Is this a threat? Like what will be the eventual impact of this thing? And I, just like Edith does, comes to find out more information, and it loses some of its harm, and it's I guess the dangerous effect that like it had on me. And I thought that was just like another really cool way this game puts you in Edith's shoes as I was moving through it, is connecting with the story in a way that changes your opinion on things as Edith would have done.
That's interesting. And once we get a little bit more into it, I want to revisit that because I told you when we started this, one of the questions that I was interested in pursuing is Edith's great grandmother, is convinced that there is a family curse, that everybody in her family is just fated to die in tragic ways, which bears out. That is, in fact, what happens. Um, and figuring out whether or not that is the curse is real is something I want to talk a little bit more about. Um, I'm glad that you brought up Sven was Edie's husband, who was quote unquote killed by a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of framing by Edie is a big part of like what the curse is. Like there is such a pervasive, almost celebration isn't quite the right word, but like I don't know, all of these deaths become like legends. And we see that borne out in the way that they're told by the family members, that they're like larger than life or these crazy surreal experiences, that they have to be almost legendary rather than, you know, tragic accidents.
Mm. That's a really good point.
And I think I mean, Molly is the first story that we walk through. And I think it's a really good one to start with because it's probably the most surreal that we get. None of the other ones have a janky shark rolling down a hill.
We gotta. This was such a strange moment for me because, like,
so fucking weird.
Throughout the beginning of the game, like it's like you're right. It's like a walking sim. You're learning a lot. You're connecting, and like whenever this story takes place, so Molly, what, like a 10-year-old girl, very young,
if that, yeah,
is confined to her room after dinner. She says she's insatiably hungry, but she's not allowed to eat anything else. So Edith is in her room after discovering like these weird passageways. I guess we should touch on that too. They decided that Edith's mother decided that it was best to, I guess in a lot of ways, like seal off like the rooms, but also like I think that's more of a metaphor than anything else. Is we need to put what happened behind us and move on, and just these people are not. We can't let what happened to them affect us. We need to move on from it. So like each room in this house is like physically sealed closed. You cannot walk through the doors here, and you can only get a small glimpse of what it was through this little eyeglass. And I think that is just so interesting because while it is very literally how Edith grew up experiencing these members of her family, it also paints like a really good picture for her understanding of these events and allows you to connect with these stories with Edith at the same time. Just a really strong way to present a narrative in a video game. And it like rooted in a fear and rooted in a mental illness. I really, really like that. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. The first time you go into Molly's room, Edith says something like, it was like walking behind a painting or walking into a painting.
Yes.
You know,
which is ironic.
Yeah. But it is
coming later.
That's a great point. But it sort of, you know, like you said, it takes this sort of what was an image or an idealized sort of memory of a person and all of a sudden makes it into something much more real. So I agree. I really like that you can first see into the rooms through the people and understand that's Edith's entire understanding of that space and also the person that occupied it. And then later on being able to walk in it and read a little bit from the person who lived there and get to know them a little better.
I think that the way that Edith has to navigate the house, just in a lot of like under the wraps, hidden passageways, and very much like going around the way that game has you navigate the house, it feels very much like you're breaking the rules, quote unquote. And I think that that's like really important that they drive it the way that they do, is that while Edith grew up looking at these things through these other through these like portals, essentially, like it's a painting, like you had mentioned. When she finally gets to these things, it is literally on a journey of discovery. And I think if they had it to where it was like, oh, she had like a knife and she pries her way into these rooms or something like that, which is very doable. Honestly, you could, it's just like a sealant. You could probably just cut through it or whatever. But the way that they have her navigate this house, I think, is just as important as the rooms themselves. And it's her having to physically overcome these obstacles to get the information that she needs, because there is just such a strong reason as to why they don't want her to have to experience it. Or that she's so determined to find it, that she's willing to do whatever it takes to get to it. So the journey, it's just another example, as I think the crux of this game is that the journey very much is part of the entire story.
The real trauma was the friends we made along the way.
Listen, I will never forget. I have to like take a brief pause on this game. I know this is completely immersion breaking, but on the launch of Redfall, God forbid, like that game ever comes out of its.
How did we not talk about Redfall?
Probably because no one ever wants to talk about Redfall again. I played that game with Russ and Roger and Justin on, I think it was launch or like the day after launch or whatever. We played about 2.5 hours of it and we jumped off, and naturally we never went back to it.
Naturally, but none of us ever talked again.
It was Russ that said, you know, guys, it was the real Redfall was the friends we made along the way. And that's really stuck with me, not because it's true, but because that was the only reason I had any fun at all that night. Was not the game, it was the conversations. But yeah, I think that, I know I've already said it, but I think the journey through the house is a very important way to tell the story here. The self-discovery portion of it, while somewhat literal, is just as much of a metaphor for how Edith has to come to the conclusion at the end of the game that we're trying to drive at ourselves.
I think that makes total sense. Like, very early on, we get a sense of how Edith has navigated this house her entire life. Which rooms are accessible and which ones aren't. Very early on, we're like, you know, entering rooms that we've never been into, or breaking out of the window and climbing around trees into other places. And like, he's experiencing or like moving through the house in a very different way because she needs to change her relationship to it and by extension her family. You know,
yeah, that's a good point.
So to jump back to Molly real quick. Molly is the first sort of family member. We read her diary. She was sent to bed without any supper. She eats a lot of shit that she shouldn't. And then all of a sudden she becomes a cat. And this is sort of the moment where the narrative becomes surreal. Was that jarring in any way, playing it for the first time?
Well, yeah, the game itself like has like a very serious tone up to this point, and it is like very much for the most part like grounded in reality, and sets a pretty strong precedence for being grounded in reality right up front. But then like you turn into a cat and jump out a window. Like, no, I really. I like the creative, literal creative leap here, because we have to remember whose diary we're reading. You know, it's like you can think about it in the sense of like, I was just standing at this window and I turned it into a cat and jumped out. That's lame, but like, especially with someone who has kids, like the imagination of a kid is just it's absolutely bonkers, wild, and it's not something you ever want to take away from them. So being able to experience like multiple layers of this weird, like story, I guess you could call it, was like really interesting. I probably wouldn't have eaten toothpaste beforehand. Might have been the hallucinogen that caused this really weird story.
Or like some unidentified berries that are growing in her window. Not a great call historically.
Yeah, that was probably had a lot to do with it. But like,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a precedence too that the game sets right up front, is being able to link at least with each story, not right up front, but like with each story, finding what is rooted in reality and what is not, and what the reason for that may be, which is where probably the most of our speculation for each of these stories, at least realistic discussion, will probably be rooted in. But yeah, just to get back to like your original question, I thought the creative decisions here were just remarkable. I like, as a dad of like a 4-year-old, I like listening to Sloane tell me about like the magical adventures she went on in her dreams, and like how she wants to be a princess, and like all this kind of stuff. And it's really cool. And like, this felt very, very natural to me to like, oh, I turned into a cat and then I chased a bird and I was really hungry. And then as it goes on, and then you turn into a bird, and it was remarkably difficult to control that damn bird to catch the rabbits.
Yeah.
It got a little gruesome.
It's pretty grotesque.
And then it got really strange. We just randomly turn into a ragdolling shark and roll down a hill. Like, I legitimately didn't know what to think at that moment. But then it turned into another frustrating bit of chasing your food. And then it just got Lovecrafty in like a second. So yeah, like it was really, it was weird. Like, there's just no other way to say it. It was really weird.
I think you bring up a good point, though, that there is kind of like an underlying reality to all these stories, that you can probably suss out. One of the things that I really like about the design of Molly's room is that you can see like basically like all of the inspiration for this weird dream sequence around her room. Like, there's this big octopus toy that's sitting at the foot of her bed, and you're like, oh, fucking, that's where that came from.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like, it's clearly, obviously the game is rooted in a deep sense of reality. And yet, like I said, you have to take the narratives or the narrator's word for a lot of things. But yeah, thinking about like how insatiably hungry, whenever a kid is hungry, they don't do anything but let you know that they're hungry, and they never stop talking about it. And food is the only thing that's important to them.
Yeah.
So like, it's interesting to see how they tackled this, how they force you to do the things that ultimately end up leading to that to be the last journal entry that she had.
And that's kind of, yeah. I said at the top that this game is about unreliable narrators. And I think maybe that phrase gets a lot of heat that it shouldn't. Because an unreliable narrator isn't necessarily trying to trick you.
Right.
What they're trying to do is express their story as they envisioned it. So when you see Molly, like you're talking about, when kids are hungry, it's the only fucking thing they think about. And through Molly's kind of expression of like, I was a cat, and then I was a bird, and then I was a shark, things that constantly just think about eating, getting more and more monstrous over time. Like, it's not literally true, but it brings you into Molly's experience of what was happening with her in a much more realistic or kind of visceral sort of way, rather than just writing down I was hungry 8,000 times.
Yeah, I had it in my notes. It was instinctual to hit to her, because like, kids in their most basic sense, they don't know what we think that they're like unintelligible, But like even a baby at the age of 6 months, it cries when it's uncomfortable. It cries when it's hungry. Like it knows exactly what it needs, and kids just think like that. So it's interesting to find the primal needs, the most instinctual needs, to be represented in a way that is that like deep carnal, like in its truest form, how we as adults would see that like as a monster or something like that in a kid's mind. That would be the natural how they would think about how like, oh my goodness, I'm so hungry, I could eat a person, I could eat all of this. Like, I don't, so, like if I ask Sloan if she wants a popsicle, she's like, oh my gosh, I want 50. Like that's just that's what they think about. And in her mind, like she would want 50 of them. So like, it's just a natural. I like how realistic the representation of the imagination of the child is in this. Unfortunately, it did hurt as most of the stories in this game, come to their conclusion. Realizing the reality of the situation is incredibly jarring and painful. So, I guess the implications, some of them in this game are they're very on the nose. Molly's is almost right on the nose, but it is sort of left up to interpretation. I guess the presumption being that she either, there's kind of two ways to take it. She either dove out the window and died, or she died from food poisoning from eating way too many things which is the most likely.
I would say, because I think that is like almost kind of a misdirect, that you're supposed to think that she went out the window, but also she wrote a fucking diary about what it felt like to be dying. So you have to assume.
Or what in a kid's way that felt like it was dying. So yeah, and that's initially like it does kind of do it, like you said, the unreliable narrator thing, because it like she tells the story like, mom said I wasn't allowed to eat anything and is depriving me of food. And like literally when I heard it, I was like, well, that's kind of messed up. Like what? But like at no other point in the story are you made to think that like she's an abusive mother,
right?
Like at all. You just get the idea that, and then you're like, oh, I'm reading a young kid's diary.
Look at Michael siding with the parents.
Oh man,
no, that's a really
as someone point. As someone whose daughter suffers from like blood sugar illnesses, I unfortunately, regardless of how evil she is, cannot send her to bed without dinner, it could be remarked as child abuse. So, but yeah, all in all, just like this being like the first real encounter you have with any of the other characters' stories in this game, a very harrowing experience, and like makes you like sit up in your seat and go, okay, like I should start really paying attention to what's going on. Like, but yeah, that's Molly Finch.
That's Molly Finch. From there we move on to Barbara's, and this is probably, I don't think there's really necessarily a low point in Edith Finch. Barbara's story, which is sort of a kind of like, I don't know, 80s slasher-esque kind of like, yes.
This story was like, as crazy as this was represented, and how it is absolutely not like a representation of the game as a whole. It very much is. Like it is 100% in and 100% out at the same time. But like this story was like my all-in moment. Like this was so, like other stories resonated with me harder, but as far as like pure gameplay, like I loved this. Like this was so cool because it not only told the story in a new way, it like changed the graphics of the game. It like you moved different. It like played like a comic book. It was like whenever you saw Into the Spider-Verse for the first time and you're like, they can do this with movies. I had that same exact reaction with like video games.
I'm so glad to hear. I was really worried about this just because like they cheese it up a lot, which I mean for the setting works really well. But I could see people like bouncing off of this a little bit if they don't understand like, that it is kind of there's a frame of reference here,
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things that I was looking up trivia for this that I thought was funny. They use music in this that's similar to John Carpenter's theme from Halloween.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Because it is John Carpenter's theme from Halloween. Like they got permission from him to use it.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, I mean, it's like even I don't really care for Halloween movies like at all. I think Mike Myers is like a terrible movie villain.
Mm.
But like I loved this, and it's immediately recognizable. But just to like give a frame of reference, I know we've kind of went down like our own little personal.
Yeah, we got into this hard.
Throughout when you're moving through the house, you'll see these like pictures of like Bigfoot and like movie posters and Barbara's names on them. But essentially, Barbara was a child star, who was as a kid was well known for horror movies and her iconic like horror movie Final Girl Scream. And as she got older, she lost her stardom and had to resort to, she got depressed and was trying to get her constantly find her way back in. And she had to resort to Comic-Cons and things like that, which this game makes them sound like a bad thing. And that kind of upsets me because I have been to so many cons. But yeah, so that's kind of like the frame of reference. So, when you get into her room, you walk into someone's room that was very much tied to who they were and was very much living in the past and could not get past that. In every aspect of it. The room itself is literally almost like an extended hallway that forces you as you're moving through it to live each one of those moments like almost in a sequence, like a roll of film. Yeah. And I think that's intentional as you're moving through it, until it gets all the way to the end to the bed where it was kind of laid to rest. And that's where you find the information on not on the bed, but near the bed. So, but yeah, so that kind of gives the frame of reference. But what I like most about the story is it has is it the comic book that tells the story?
It is the comic book. Yeah.
Okay. So you pick up this comic book and it has like this pumpkin head weird monster.
It's like as close as we can get to the Crypt Creeper without calling it the Crypt Keeper kind of deal.
Yeah, and it tells essentially that exact story of Barbara, who is a child star. And I'm assuming the implication here is that this was an actual book that was written.
Yeah. Yep.
Kind of like a biopic on her life told in a way that would honor her story in a very weird, strange way.
Yeah.
But yet kind of victimize her in a lot of other ways too. So, I guess more emotionally victimized than actually victimized. But, so it tells that story of a child star who was kind of left out in the dust. And then when she was older, her and her boyfriend were attacked in the night by an escaped villain. They
call him a hookman, as if that's just an established thing. You know how like occasionally there's hookmen?
Yeah, I've seen I Know What You Did Last Summer. But yeah, so it's like it tells the story and then it breaks away and lets you like play as Barbara. And I'm a little fuzzy on like the specifics of the details, but essentially you navigate the house and there's somebody quote unquote in the house and you go down into the basement, which this part really got me. And then you like open the door and it's our boyfriend and he's like, blah, and then jumps out and scares you.
So you beat the shit out of him with his own crutch because you're an ass.
I mean, rightfully so. He
Yeah,
definitely deserves it. But yeah, so, and then that's whenever things take a turn to the worst, and you find out that the Hook Man is in the house. Barbara pushes him over the banister, thinks that he's dead. He's not. Walter cannot be found anywhere, who's the other kid that's in the house at the time. And then Barbara hears a knock at the door, goes to answer it, and it's like all these monsters that come in and I guess congratulate her and tell her how good of a job she's done or give her some type of party, and then proceed to brutalize her and murder her.
Evidently, yeah. This one's weird.
It is very weird.
This one, I have a hard time figuring out exactly like what's the story underneath this kind of like hyper reality that we're being pitched here. And one of the things that confuses it the most that I noticed on this most recent playthrough, if you go upstairs next to Molly's room, the banister's broken right where like the Hook Man in the comic book went over the side of it. So like something did happen there.
My take on it was that I think they lightly touch on it. But my take on it was that whoever this person, there was someone that was obsessed with her and grew up with her, and that was her boyfriend. That person got so close to her and was just obsessed with her because they also grew up watching her in the horror movies. They were more obsessed with who she was than she was in her past than who she is as a person, that they were so, he was obsessed with helping her find her scream.
Right.
And whenever he finally got that out of her, he killed her. And I think that ultimately, the reason I think that is not because it jives, it's because it fits with how they're presenting her story. It's that she was so obsessed with who she was that it ended as her demise. And ultimately, who she was trying to be was what ended up killing her.
Yeah, that would. So I mean,
the Hook Man was very real, but her boyfriend used that as an excuse to try to get away with it, and ultimately, he did get away with it.
Yeah,
because there was someone that got out of prison.
That's fair. That's a good point, and I think that would fit kind of narratively because, you know, the whole idea Barbara's trying to reclaim that fame and recognition that she had as a kid. And in a sick way, she gets that if there's somebody who's obsessed enough with her old career to get close to her and then kill her.
Right. And that's exactly my point, is that the people that you see, the Bigfoot, that it's very heavily telegraphed that was like her best thing. It was like the Bigfoot, indicating that it was a monster or something like that she was so connected to. So her being the only person in her life that believed in her was also a monster. And that person just like behind the scenes subtly grew and grew and grew on her, but was feeding on the parts of her fear and her insecurity for her past. And that ultimately ended up being the thing, the monster, the person that had always been there that she was going after ended up being. So whenever she opened the door, it was a monster that killed her. It was her boyfriend, and that's the reason that she was welcoming to it. And it seemed like they were there to console her and congratulate her because she got her scream back, and then it killed her.
I guess the real Bigfoots were the boyfriends we made along the way.
I hate you.
It felt real. That didn't feel like a bit.
Barbara's story, like I said, the gameplay wise was like I was having the most fun. I was like, this is cool. It was like upbeat, fast paced, interesting, like really easy to connect with, and just fun and scary. Like,
yeah, it's the most tense for sure.
For sure, yeah. It definitely wasn't my all in narratively, but I guess this is, if any game is going to have like a point where we can break those two things up, it would be this game.
I guess that's a good point.
But yeah, so that's Barbara. And if you're noticing, like we mentioned a few minutes ago, we've done 2 of these already. There's a lot of people to cover, but only like 5 or 6 of them that have these like deep entrenched stories.
Yeah.
And if you're noticing a theme here, it's that, like you mentioned before, all of their tales are heavily like put into legend, and then made to look much more grandiose than they ultimately really were. And so far with Molly, there's this transformative journey that she goes on through these different stages of her hunger. And then with Barbara, it's this whole a literal comic book, like memorializing her downfall. So yeah. But in Barbara's story, there is the Walter that her brother that she tells to hide, and no one ever found him. Not just in the story, but like in real life, he went missing and no one found him for, was it 30 years?
Yeah.
30 years he went missing. So yeah, I guess that would be the logical next place to go here.
That's the next place to go. You basically, one of the nice things about Barbara's is that gameplay sequence where you are navigating the house as Barbara, you follow the same path as Edie, where you go down into the basement and to the fridge. In Barbara's story, that's where her boyfriend's hiding. In Edith's, she finds in the basement fridge a false door, which leads down to this crazy bunker where Walter, Barbara's brother, had lived for 30 years, just by himself. So we find a note that's left behind by Walter, and that's kind of the transition into Walter's gameplay, which is sparse. You're going to be opening a lot of cans as Walt, because that's basically all Walter does day in and day out is sit down, open a can of peaches, eat the can of peaches, and hear some crazy rumbling.
Without chewing them.
Without chewing, just in one. Fucking mad lad. And listen to this crazy rumbling that he thinks is trying to kill him. That's just outside of his bunker. Eventually, as you go through Walter living the same day over and over again throughout decades, eventually he decides not to be ruled by that kind of fear anymore. So he escapes the bunker, and things go really well for him. He escapes out to some train tracks and is almost instantly pulverized by the same rumbling that he's heard outside of his bunker day in and day out for years. It is such a small, like 2-minute sequence maybe that you play as Walter, but so deeply affecting, I think, for how ironic and sad it is, especially because this note that you're reading is left by him right before he leaves.
This is the moment in the game that I just emotionally connected with like the hardest, and it hit me for a lot of reasons. I think the main reason this really connects with me is because a lot of games are guilty of this, is whenever a child is left all on their own and they go and move on to like the next phase of their life to where they're in their 30s or their 40s and they grew up by themselves, they have the temperament and the mentality of a 30 or 40-year-old at that point in time. What I love most about this is that it captures the sense that Walter as a young 10, 11-year-old boy has been on his own since then. And the ideas of his childhood, the monsters that he thought were there on the island at the same time rumbling to try to get him, persisted as if in that state of where he had no sense of maturity outside of that primal need to survive that we talked about before. So one, there's a little bit of consistency in the theming that you run across here, but two, it keeps the idea of that inner child alive and really cements the fact that he truly was alone, and that regardless of all the books and all the things that he would spend his time on to fill these last 30 years, he's still had a deep fear. And I think one of the cool things about this is that this was just something I thought about. It could just be completely like BS, but it was just something that weighed heavily on me. everyone in this house, there's like hundreds and hundreds of books all over the place. And presumably, even though in the game there are a lot of the same ones just because they're reusing assets,
Right.
but presumably none of them would be the same. So there's this many books just like sitting in this room. Presumably he likely would have read all of them. It leads you to think that there is nothing in this family's library that they mention so many times about making oneself better or maturing. And I think that shows a lot in how Walter never emotionally really matures in that time. And it kind of plays into the story of like everyone's feeding into this idea of this family curse. No one really wanted to better themselves or push beyond their limits. Again, this is all speculation. I'm not saying this is a theme they're trying to get at, but the idea that he was trapped down here for so long and he was never able to pull a larger sense of self over that 30 years, I feel like maybe it kind of tells the type of more of the underlying environment that all of these people grew up in over the years.
I think that's true. What makes Walter's story, I think, particularly sad is that at the end he did want to better himself. That was his escape, was to stop living the same day over and over again. He's one of the few, I think, in the story that, like, a lot of these stories are brought about by some fatal flaw, like Barbara wanting to reclaim her childhood, or Edith's brother, Lewis, who wants to live in his own reality, and can't distinguish between his two anymore. But Walter just wants to, like, start a life. That's his only flaw, really. I guess, like, he's being punished for the amount of, like, how long it took him, I guess, to decide to start a life outside of the house.
I think what I took away from that the most is that he had spent so long contained in this reality, but never had the chance to mature just due to the life that was put in front of him. And at the point in time that he had gained the emotional maturity or the courage to finally step outside of his comfort zone, albeit 30 years later, the weight of the world was there to meet him once again.
Yeah.
But it tells a journey not of being swallowed by fear and self-doubt. It tells a journey of acceptance and being able to meet things head on and face it, regardless of what the outcome is, which was quite literally his final words.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, like, really, really powerful. Especially, it is extremely sad. This thing that he feared every day for 30 years, he finally meets out to face it, and it instantly kills him. But it was just this, I guess what I'm trying to say is this story alone is one of the strongest indicators of the family curse being a facade.
Yeah.
Because it is very much like I said, it tells that story of someone finally be willing to face, and it was what they perceived as the monster that was coming to get them was something that they just didn't understand and know enough about. And then when you get to the end of the story, it is literally about Edith documenting her journey to help the next generation understand so they don't have to go through the same thing. And that's why I think the story resonated with me most. And I know I'm jumping a little to
but I think that's
to
good.
the end there.
And I think, like, the question of whether or not the curse is real, I think, is difficult because it does have an impact on the family. The belief in a curse has an impact on the family. And whether or not that is, it's not supernatural, I don't think, but it is kind of self-perpetuated. You know, the belief in the
Yeah.
curse makes a curse of itself. That people think they're sort of resigned to these kind of fates. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I really really liked Walter's story, despite it being over very quickly.
Yeah. But there's a lot to cover here, so we'll
Yeah,
jump on.
we'll
But
keep moving.
Walter's a good one.
Mm-hmm. So from Walters, we get into the twins. Twins are Sam and I'm blanking on the other kid's name. Um, Sam's brother is the one who's obsessed with space and goes around on the swing.
That's a really good question. I had a family tree pulled up here. Sam and Calvin.
Calvin, that's my guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Calvin's is the next one we do. And Calvin's story is sad for sure. I mean, they're all sad. Most of them are about kids dying.
Yeah.
But really, I think Calvin's story, I think, was affecting for me because it clearly had an impact on Sam. And that's somebody that I think we get to know a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
So Sam is Edith's grandfather. Obviously, he's impacted by his twin brother dying at a very young age. And I think he kind of carries a lot of that guilt and sadness into his own life and how he raises his three kids, who also, spoiler, uh, mostly die prematurely.
That's a weird thing for me to laugh at, but it's
Yeah.
true. I think what I like most about this story, if you look at Sam and Calvin, is that they go on to tell the story of Sam, who's very, very grounded in reality, nature, very focused on what's right in front of him. He was the military guy, right?
Yeah.
He went through the military and all that.
Sad.
And Calvin lived in a entirely different world. But I think the best way to look at it is that they lived in this world of discovery and exploration together as kids. And because Calvin had his head in the clouds and was focused on space and wanting to be like an explorative and looking at the supernatural all the time, his death is what caused Sam to veer hard right and pivot off that path and just be focused on everything else.
Yeah.
Because it was clearly too painful for him to come to terms with. He roped off the room entirely, never went back to it. It's literally untouched from whenever he was a kid, as most of the rooms are. But it tells a story of heart wrench and pain from another person's perspective, because this is the first one where you get a secondary viewpoint on one of the deaths that takes place. So
I don't think that's a leap at all, really, to see how much Calvin's death really impacted Sam. And I think this is like you're saying, it's a secondary perspective because Sam's one of the few that makes it to adulthood. So we get to see the kind of person that Sam became, who has to carry a lot of this trauma. Sam himself is killed on a hunting trip with his daughter, and it's told in a series of photographs, which I thought this is an impactful one. This is an interesting one in terms of gameplay.
This one hit me pretty hard because Sam dies at the age of 33 doing things with his daughter. I am 33 and enjoy doing things with my daughter. So this was no lie, this was I don't hunt, I don't do anything like that, but it was really easy to connect with. And what I like most about this story is how deeply rooted, and I know we're pivoting onto Sam, actual Sam's story here, but how deeply rooted it was, and this feels like something that I could see happening every day. just an honest mistake, that one of those things that wrapped up in that moment could be perceived as just another portion of this curse. But what really struck me about this story was that it wasn't. A lot of these stories have like some horrendous accident or some like fatal flaw. What hurts about this story was that he's so focused on what he's doing. If he had been by himself, then he probably wouldn't have made this mistake.
Mm.
But he's so focused on enjoying his time with his daughter and ensuring that she has a good life that distracts him and causes him to make a mistake that ends up leading to his death. And I think that is really, really powerful. Especially, like you said, being one of the few that makes it out of his childhood.
Yeah. Yeah. You see the kind of things that he's trying to instill in Dawn. And you're right. He sort of phrasing it as he makes a mistake that he wouldn't have made by himself, I think is a good way of explaining it.
Well, I obviously agree because that's what I said, but like I guess I should preface it by saying that they do a lot of lead up to Sam talking about his past with his brother, how that emotionally impacted him, how he immediately got out and went to the military as soon as he could, how when he came back, he was very much like a nature man. He knew what he was doing. He felt like he had a purpose. He had a daughter. So prefacing it with the idea that he was so self-focused and was determined to get out, and having a kid and furthering the family was so important to him, and it fundamentally changed everything about who he was. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, when we come around to the final, discussion about the curse being real or not, I think it's very important to remember what decisions he made in his personal life that led from him being this loner, not necessarily hating his family, but wanting to get away from it and all the tragedy, to potentially ending up contributing to it through the means of his daughter.
Yeah. And something that I think we're sort of overlooking here, and I am using this as a transition, is that Calvin isn't the only loss in Sam's life. It's not even the most recent loss in Sam's life. He's also lost his son, Gregory, at 1 year old, which is, I'm not even sure how to lead into this one, because the story of Gregory's death is done so artfully and I think so well that it is simultaneously joyful and colorful and haunting. Just incredible shit.
But before you jump into Gregory,
sure.
I don't think we actually officially said it. Sam's brother was Calvin, and he died because he was swinging on the edge of a cliff.
Right.
And I just wanted to point out that he died because his brother was pushing him to face his fears of heights. And I think that I bring it up because that contributes to why Sam was who he was, why he wanted to get out of the way of the family. A lot of that probably had to do with that guilt that he was feeling for pushing his brother into, ultimately causing his death.
I think that's true.
So,
the other thing is that Sam is the one who writes Calvin's eulogy. And he talks a lot about when Calvin made his mind up to do something, he did it. And I think that's something that Sam clearly very much admires about Calvin, and something that he's taken forward into the kind of person he became as somebody who is decisive and takes action.
Yeah, I agree. But I just wanted to touch on that really quick.
Yeah.
Because they're very much hand in hand intentionally. So anyway, the Gregory, this is really haunting.
Yeah.
Because they take probably the most horrific like happening in terms of like the age of the death, which is 1 year old, and make it probably like the most artful and musical and interesting. I don't want to say interesting because it definitely was not the most interesting, but like the most
I wasn't sitting there playing
innocent.
it going, oh, this is interesting.
It was the most innocent
Yeah.
thing. But you think about this in the way that we talked about Molly. You're meeting the character where they are with in sense of what they may have, been experiencing in that moment. But ultimately, who was Gregory's mother?
Gregory's mother was, what's her name? They divorced shortly after this. That's the lead-in for Gregory's story.
Kay?
Kay.
Was it Kay?
Yes.
Was it Kay?
It was
okay.
Kay.
So Gregory is in a bathtub, and if you've not played this game yet, you really need to stop and play it and come back. But Gregory's in a bathtub, and right away, whenever I started playing as Gregory, I knew where this was going, and it made me physically ill. Like as I was continuing, because this is like a parent's worst freaking nightmare, dude. Like
that's most of these stories, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, but like I'll say this. Whenever you have a kid, you're in the hospital, and I had the very fortunate circumstance that my wife had kids before we were together. So when we had our child, she had been through this, and it was still very scary leaving the hospital less than 24 hours after my wife had given birth, and they go, here's a newborn, keep it alive. And I'm like, it's hard enough, like trying to like figure out like how to do that. I can't imagine as like a new couple having to, to do these things, but like every single thing that you do, you're like, is this going to hurt this child? You have to constantly be thinking about the fact that this thing literally can't do anything by itself. So when they have a 1-year-old sitting in a bathtub, I immediately am like, like, why? But yeah, so I like the segment, and I begrudgingly continued. And I think that they obviously set it up and want you to know what you're getting in for this segment. I think there's a few reasons for this. One, because it makes the narrative much more impactful. But two, there's a lot of people that, I mean, let's just be frank about it, might have stopped playing it if they had got to the end of it and were just like, oh, I don't know if I'm okay with that.
Right.
So like leading it signposting it pretty early on was probably a pretty good decision in terms of like how to put the game together.
If you've gotten to this point, you should know what you're in for.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, so the water slowly is rising in the bathtub, and more of the toys fall off the walls, and you're playing as this like frog that you're quite literally like pushing down under the water and like making it go higher and knocking more toys into the tub.
You're doing baby shit.
Yeah, naturally. Me when I take my baths. But the whole time there'll be like these segments where it like stops and the mom will come over and somebody is on the phone and they're having a conversation that she clearly does not want to be having. And she's very, very distracted, which is if you consider the outcome is probably the best thing for her to be. Hopefully that wouldn't be the outcome if she was not distracted. But what I like about this segment is just how, like I said, the juxtaposition between how innocent and how awful, like, it truly is. It almost turns into like this orchestra or some type of interpretive dance with like all of these toys.
Yeah. It's a ballet.
And what I thought was the most haunting part of it is that there's like this subtle objective to try to knock your own name off the wall. And I really hated that because after like revisiting that sequence in my mind, I'm like, the objective was to kill yourself. Like,
Mm-hmm.
in that, like, it's an uncomfortable realization to have to come to with what the game is directing you to do in that moment. But I think we have to remember the game isn't wanting you to kill a child here. The game is telling you a story. But what it's doing is it's creating a sense of continuity with Edith and the story and forcing you to be uncomfortable with the horrific things that Edith is also experiencing in that moment. It's very crucial to remember that while you're playing these things. It's not about making you lament the death of this child and the fact that you played it in the game. It's Edith is reading this and experiencing it like this as you are too.
Yeah.
However, what I think is important in this, I think this sequence is probably the most unimmersive portion of the game, because you have this story that Edith is putting together from the divorce note, essentially, that's left between Kay and Sam. Is it?
Yeah. Yep.
Reading this divorce note, and I fail to see how this story like is. The other ones have a very clear connection with how Edith draws that conclusion, but this one just feels a little far out to me. It feels like they could have maybe done a little bit of something different just with how creative they are to be able to tell the story of the death, as opposed to putting you in the 1-year-old's shoes. It just didn't feel like that would be how Edith would try to remember this story.
I see what you're saying, and I guess that makes sense. Yeah, there's a couple of ways you could do it. Keeping with the rule that like you have to play as the perspective of the person whose death you're experiencing. You know, what we talked about earlier with Molly's story about the unrelatable narrator, not necessarily being a liar, but like their experience of it kind of telling you things about their experience that you can't get with like an objective narrative. Gregory's story, I think, shows how far removed those two stories can be. The actual like account of what happened is horrifying. Like a child dies in a bathtub. Gregory's experience of it, very different. Gregory's experience is musical and light and fun. Like it that's really where the tragedy comes in, is how far between his experience and what actually happened actually are. So I thought it was effective for that, but you're right. I think in terms of immersion, there are other things they could have done here.
Yeah, and I don't say that to like critique the game in any way. Like I think this is very fitting and very telling for this segment of the story. It just like for everyone else, when you're experiencing the story through their eyes, it makes sense to pick up what she picked up or see what she saw and kind of relive it in that way. I didn't feel like there was a great way for Edith to tap into that while she was reading a note from Sam. Now, I mean, the note did go on to say things like how he was very imaginative and creative and just fun, and maybe that obviously that's where they're pulling that from. But I'm in no way when I say that like I'm critiquing it, I'm looking at something that's a 9 out of 10 and not being,
No, but I see what you're saying, because the note isn't really describing like, I mean, this is their divorce papers, is what she's reading.
Yeah.
And she's not reading Gregory's experience in that moment. What she's reading about is Sam's. Like the sort of narration that we get throughout Gregory's story. It's about how Sam feels about Gregory's death.
Yeah, for
which
sure.
may be like that kind of disconnection that you're feeling between the two, which I think is absolutely fair.
Yeah, but I mean that I don't think I felt that way during the game though. The game keeps you pretty sucked in. Like definitely wasn't something that I was playing it and I was like, "Oh, that felt dumb," or anything like that. It was that was like thinking about it later on. I came to that conclusion. So don't let that dissuade you if you're thinking about playing this. But definitely gut wrenching.
Yeah. These next two I want to cover like somewhat quickly. There isn't a ton to these next two. The first one is Gus, who is Sam's other son, Gregory's brother. Gus dies at Sam's wedding. He's flying a kite, and there's a giant storm, and the storm somehow kills him. It's left somewhat ambiguous. Correct me if I'm wrong, or correct. Like, feel free to disagree with me here, but I didn't feel like Gus was given a whole bunch of screen time. Like, I didn't feel a lot of pull here.
Yeah, it was relatively difficult to connect with this one, but I think there's a reason for this. His story is told via a poem. And this is another one of those times where the impact comes more in the gameplay itself than actually what's being told. But you have two ways of experiencing things in this game. Edith is picking up something and reading a perspective of a character. And this one, she's picking up something and reading that person's interpretation of additional events, very similar to how Gregory did this. So whenever she's reading this poem, she's reading about something, she's reading an interpretation of events from a person through the eyes of someone else. So like there's multiple layers that Edith is having to like really dig through here. And that's why I think it's intentional that you don't connect as much with this as other ones. It's not to say it's not as impactful, but it's I think this story is very much a victim of the gameplay itself.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point, is that this is an interpretive work because it's a poem, about a secondhand account. And then you're playing as a sort of dramatized events. That's interesting.
But yeah, you're right though. There's not a lot to it. You get that Gus is like, he's pretty edgy, for a 13-year-old
he's the fucking kid.
Yeah, he's got the mohawk. You flip your dad off when he tells you what to do. Like, he's not happy about the family growing. That typical like the punk rocker kind of vibe. That he's throwing up his mohawk and throwing middle fingers and then flying his kite. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
For like a 12-year-old, that actually does make a lot. That scans.
That's fair, I guess so. But yeah, so like you're flying your kite in the storm rebelliously over top the entire wedding, and you kind of have to dash out like the words, which I thought that was interesting because it was almost like in that moment you were rebelling against like the narrative, which is like the attitude of a typical 13-year-old boy, especially one that is trying to actively be a rebel, fight the establishment. But I think it does a good job of capturing that. But essentially, like, what you end up doing to the puzzle with the kite, it kind of like thematically flows into, being what ends up being his downfall. He picks up the entire storm and dashes all the equipment in the tent onto him, essentially killing him. So, I think you're right though. There's not a lot of weight to this one. It doesn't feel as impactful, and it feels like you walk past it and you're like, oh, look, a poem, neat. I'm going to go upstairs now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Effectively. The only thing that maybe it does is, in the same way that Gregory's story gives you more insight into Sam, the story for Gus is written by Dawn, which is Edith's mom. and gets you a little bit more into insight into where she's coming from. And
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that's a good like segue into um, Edith or Dawn has three kids of her own, and those are the last three stories that we kind of like round out. Um, she has two sons, um, Milton and Lewis, and then Edith. Milton's story is another very, very quick one. Um, Milton is an artist. His story is told primarily through a flip book. There is no narration to it, and it is pretty, pretty ambiguous and pretty strange. It's a story about a kid who basically one of his paintings comes to life and gives him a paintbrush in order that enables him to walk into a painting, which he does, bows, and disappears. And that's it. That is curtains on Milton. And it's weird because we never get confirmation about what happens to him. He's presumed dead because, all the Finches are dead. But we don't really know what happened to him.
At least not in this game.
And, yeah, you caught on to what I was going to say. Fucking dick.
No, but I really like that because I'll wait we'll get back to Milton at the end because I think that
put a pin in Milton.
There's some stuff to cover here, but one thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is we get up until this point we have been in like the core of the house,
right?
And it's kind of like you're in the main structure. And you kind of forgotten that this house is like this foreboding, strangely weird structure that just feels like kind of tacked on. And what I really think is important here is that the house itself is like a self-contained little unit, I guess you could say. And then as it goes on, it gets more hodgepodge and things are just like tacked on. There's a fucking boat that's like stuck into the side of the house, and that's one of the rooms. And it goes up from there and gets more and more strange. The house itself is very, very very structured similarly to how the family tree is structured, growing and kind of compounding on itself as it goes all the way to the top, as the way the stories kind of tell themselves. So there's a lot of like compounding narrative elements there too. But I like how the house goes from being like a normal house and it gets more and more strange as it goes on. As do the stories and the creativity and the depth of what the game is trying to convey. So it's like as the stories stray from being traditional, as does the house. And I think that's is a very strong way to tell the story.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so we come to understand that the top floor of the house is a new addition that was added on once Dawn and her family moved back into the house after Edith's dad dies. So you can kind of see like how as you move up through the house, you can see how it's changed over time. That's another thing that I really like about this game is that each of these stories are sort of set in a particular time period, and it really feels that way. And the house does become more quote unquote modern as you move up towards the top of it, as do these stories.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else about Milton before we move to Lewis?
The only thing I want to say about Milton is that what I liked most, and I immediately saw it and was like, interesting. Obviously he was a painter and there's a lot of like paintings all over the place, but there's a huge painting of like a door with like a golden handle that is referenced in his flip book of him disappearing. And this is the fact that he's never found is like, it's really cool, I think, because it gives you the whole game up to this point has been like, there's been a lot of crazy stuff, but for the most part, it's been grounded in a deep, horrific reality. But the way that Milton's story is presented, while there is quote unquote more to it, maybe it's outside the bounds of this narrative, are deeply like troubling for the overall sense of like the Finch ancestry. But we'll get on that too. I wanted to talk about that painting because like I saw it and it was really jolting and like really sets the first thing you really see whenever you get into his room, and it really sets the tone for what you really think about Milton as you get his story uncovered. So
yeah, one of the things that I thought was really impressive, just from like a mechanical, quote unquote, a mechanic, is that when you flip through his flip book, it's not just like a canned animation. You can stop and literally go like frame by frame, where each one of those like little images you can pick out, which they didn't have to do that, but it adds to, this sort of immersion. It shows that when they say Milton is an artist, I think they take it seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. And there's a lot of scenes where you'll make a movement, but like the way that Edith's hands function in this game are, for being like just really small movements of the mouse, it's very like well put together and allows you to have a lot of creativity in how you experience each of these stories. So if you go to revisit this game, or you're going to go to it for the first time up to this point, definitely keep that in mind, is that, the turning mechanics or the page flips, or like whenever you're flipping pages or things like that, you have a lot of creative freedom in how you can make Edith interact with different objects, just from a gameplay perspective, is really cool. And instead of like any other, press A to enter room, like push open the door, you have the ability to like take that breath before you like go to the next thing. So
that's a good point. One of the things that, this is a good time to bring this up. Some of the ways that we learn about Edith herself are through her actions and what we can actually physically see about like her movements and things. Because she doesn't actually talk a lot about herself or her own lived experience until basically like the last few minutes of this game, right? But even like, how she chooses to dress. Like she's got the quirky kind of like fingerless, like look like hand knitted gloves. Or even like if you tilt the camera down at some point, you can see that Edith is pregnant way before she actually says it.
I'm so embarrassed to say this. Like when I was playing this game, I always check when I'm playing games if I can see like right away. I look down and I'm like, can I see my feet when I'm moving? I look down and like I still was at the point where I didn't know what I was in for with this game. And Brittany was standing behind me, and I looked down and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "My character's kind of pudgy." And I was like, I felt ashamed in that moment, and I was like, it's a game, who cares? And then later on, when you find out that Edith is pregnant, and that's the reason she's revisiting this, is to catalog the story for her son, I was like, oh, that's why. And it's cool to like see those things and have those thoughts and then have those realizations, because if I hadn't have looked, I would have been like, oh, but like, seeing the clues before they're clues is cool.
Yeah. And it's also like one of the things that I think this game benefits from being an interactive media for, as opposed to just being like a movie or a book, where these stories would still be impactful, but I don't think nearly as engrossing, is that kind of ability to like pick up on pieces, like clues before they're clues, like you were saying, is like gathering a lot of data that the game doesn't necessarily signpost for you. But if you're curious and looking around, you can start to put it together. Yeah.
Agreed.
So we move into from Milton's room into the crazy boat room, and we've kind of tipped our hand on this one a little bit. But Lewis's story is holy fucking shit.
I think this is probably like one of the most intense I think the reason is because you have to remember the timelines that we're moving through. Like up to this point, we're dealing with things that happened in the 40s, the 50s. Like we're getting into like very modern times right now. So Lewis died in 2010, was it? Yeah, 2010 was when his death was. So the story, while a lot of these things, there's different factors, there's divorce, things that we all deal with on a daily basis. What's interesting, I think, about Lewis's story is that since we're in a modern age, there's a lot more things for us to connect to, and it starts to have the implementation of things like modern medicine and therapy and the self-actualization and realization of like a potential mental illness, the need for those types of things. And whether you agree with any of that or not, is what I love about this is that it doesn't push any of those things on you. It focuses on the fact that there's someone remembering the bounds of the game that is dealing with the idea that he's just so unsatisfied with his life, or not, that he has created a reality for himself that he would rather live in as opposed to his own.
Yeah.
And I think what kind of like what we experience with Walter, the day in, day out, mundaneness of the story really contributes to the ability to get grossly entrenched in that. But the best part about the storytelling here is that that's given to you up front, and it doesn't focus on the fact of the everyday. The story focuses on the what's going on inside of his head.
Yeah. There's this really sort of beautiful mechanic where as Lewis's fantasies become more and more prevalent, what starts out as sort of like, this tiny little part of the screen in the corner as you have to focus on this like mundane job that you're doing grows and grows until it's taking up half the screen. It's just his daydream. And then it takes over more and more until, what you're actually doing, like the reality of Lewis's life is just kind of in the background. You can just barely see it through this sort of fantasy that he's constructed. I think that was done just incredibly well.
Yeah, like, and that's the thing about Lewis's story is like the way that it's presented is so well done, and it's arguably one of the most memorable moments of this game. But it just scratches the surface of the depth of like what like the story of Lewis's, and I love that his story is like such a timepiece. I love that his story deals with like very real issues. But what I love most about it is that it's in the age that the three of them, Edith and their mother Dawn, Lewis, and was it Milton, were all in, is like I mentioned, it's like in this modern age of technology and medicine, and the drive to be something more than you really are and to make an impact is never stronger than it is in today's day and age, regardless of what the push is. So the fact that someone feels so self-confined in what they're doing, and it causes this disconnect with reality, and they're forced to present it in a way that, well, he's got, maybe the way to make him better is to reassure him and affirm him and let him go through this. We as the players at this point know that all the characters are struggling with how to deal with the fact that they're butting up against this quote unquote family curse. And it really is just a battle for survival and living as long as they can. What I think the game doesn't do here, and I think it's intentional, and I think it's wonderful that they don't, is let either Edith or the therapist in which she's reading through the eyes discuss the fact that what potentially could be taking place here is that Lewis's life is controlled he wants to have control of his own destiny. And he's created his own reality in order to do so. And if there was going to be something that was going to take his own life, he wanted it to be at his own will, in his own time, and in his own reality. And ultimately, at the point in time that happens, you surrender control of this mundane task to the total reality, which ends up being his downfall. And the family looks at it as this like really sad and morose thing, but at the whole time, there is a build up in the story of Lewis. It is constantly getting better for himself. He's not going to kingdoms and failing to conquer them. He is building and growing and becoming stronger and more connected until he receives the ultimate gift of what he was trying to accomplish. Now, I don't think suicide is a great thing, but I think that this story is more about being in control of your own destiny than it is about someone who killed themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, because I think that's saying just it's about suicide. I think it's kind of reductive. Because you're right. Lewis there are so many different kind of forces that are acting on him. One of the things that I think kind of hints at this when Edith goes into his room, he talks a lot about their father was Indian, and he says he was very proud to be Indian because it means he was more than just a Finch. And I think that shows him kind of butting up against, like, there is a preconceived expectation of what it means to be a Finch, most of which is defined by that curse. He's in a job where, like, he doesn't have any sort of outlet, and all of these things are controlled for him. So yeah, he falls back into fantasy. He constructs a reality that he is, both God and king in, and
hero. Like, I think that's important. Yeah. He's God and king in a good way. Like, he's the hero.
Right. Yeah. He is a heroic figure, and ultimately makes the choice that reality is more real to him than what's surrounding him. It's obviously it's tragic. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask a question really quick about, like, mostly because I don't have a really good answer myself, but, like, what do you think the reasoning was for the branching decisions you could make on Lewis's journey? And there's only like 2 or 3 of them, but I thought they were quite interesting. There was like the beautiful prince or the handsome queen. And there was another one, but they're non-stereotypical conjoined adjective nouns like that. Yeah. And I thought that was interesting, and I couldn't put my finger, like, other than, like, he's trying to be unique and interesting and it's his own mind and creation, but, like, was there a deeper meaning to one, having the ability to choose there, and 2, how those choices were constructed?
Yeah. Well, I think you've touched on it a little bit, I think. Part of it is that Lewis craves choice, like the ability to decide for himself, which is not something that he's been presented with, it feels like, at any point in his life. So getting to make those kind of decisions, or seeing that, I think a lot of them come for, like, as you're going down a river. And I think that might be a way in how he envisions it. In, like, his life should be a whole lot of branching paths in a way that it hasn't been. In terms of, like, the constructions, I think there is, like, some creative liberty there. That's interesting. I'd have to sit with that a little bit to really, like, piece together. But that is interesting. That is something that I clocked. But I'm with you. I don't have a good interpretation for it.
Yeah, and like I said, I had mulled over it a good bit, and just trying to figure out, because it wasn't that it felt out of place. It was just like there were, like, 2 quick decisions that you make, and it was like, I don't understand why that was like even an option to choose. Did it, because it didn't change anything? Like, I looked it up. There was no different differentiating
Mhm.
paths you take that change like really the ultimate outcome. But like you said, it could ultimately just be him striving to control whatever he can control in his own world and not having to conform to any traditional methodologies, naming conventions, how things are structured in his world. And that's why they were like just a little different and actually just kind of backwards and how it was framed. So who knows? Like regardless, like it was beautiful. It was almost like an RTS, except without any of the boring world building mechanics, or troop building mechanics, just on that overhead, like top down
Mhm.
structure. And that's kind of, this is one of those, another example of, like I talked about at the beginning, like having so many different types of worlds and narratives and stuff all jammed in one little game is about, it's just really cool to be a part of. And, um, yeah. What I did want to, we talked a little bit about like what the ending for him means, but what I thought was most interesting is whenever I was doing my own research on what people had thought about the game, I took note of this one because the overwhelming consensus here is that Lewis accidentally kills himself.
I
And yeah, it doesn't specifically say it. It says the game implies that he accidentally decapitates himself with the fish deheader. I don't think the game implies that at all.
I don't think, yeah, no, not at all. I don't think
Okay.
that's in the narrative. I think that's pretty clearly this is a suicide, pretty
Yeah.
decidedly. Um, it would be hard to. I mean, you as Lewis is imagining, you can see his workstation and how it's set up. It would be difficult to accidentally just logistically stick your head underneath.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and I think that would also wipe away a lot of Lewis's character and his agency. Um, this is a decision he makes. Like I would argue pretty strongly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I mean, it's pretty signposted by the narrative, and maybe what they mean is like they had chalked it up to a suicide or something like that, or a
An
accidental
accident.
suicide. But like, I don't even remember that in the game. I remember it just pretty blatantly being like he committed suicide. Um,
Yeah. The only way you could interpret it as an accident, and this is stretching the definition of accident, is if you think that Lewis is so engrossed in this fantasy world that he's created for himself that he physically, like he actually doesn't realize what he's doing. Um, which I think would be, I don't know. I think
I
it's a
think
tough
that, like
sell.
you mentioned before, I think that's reductive because he's
Yeah.
clear. It's signpost it's pretty clearly by the fact that he's bringing food home from his family, from the cannery.
Mhm.
He's actively still looking out for other people. He's doing his job every day. They said he's a model employee. They never had issues with him. Like, I think his faculties are all there. He just would rather live in this world than the
Yeah.
real one.
I agree with that completely.
Um, one thing I will say, that, and again, this is something I took note of. I completely misread. I thought it said 1998 to 2010 whenever I first saw his age. So I was like, this kid is 12 years
12
old
years
working in a
old, working in a.
factory. He's smoking pot all the time. Like, what kind of, like, they're just letting kids out there just rip bongs and go work at the cannery with like these guillotines. Like, shit. And then, like, literally, it wasn't until after like they showed like the side of his face and he had like a little mustache and stuff. I was
Yeah.
like, holy crap, this kid has developed. And then I looked in the book and I was like, oh, 22, not 12. Okay. Okay. Like, this makes so much more sense.
Yeah, you didn't
Um,
have a factory job in fourth grade? Must be nice. Must be nice.
I was gonna say I don't know if that joke is there's a
Yeah.
lot of people out there that might hear that and be like, oh man. Anyway, but yeah, so that's Lewis. Arguably like the most beautifully told. I think
I think so.
Walter like hit me the hardest, like emotionally, but I think Lewis was like wonderfully told, very succinct, heart wrenching. brutal. Like,
this is the most immersive too. This is where like I think the what you're actually doing, the physical like actions that you go through, most kind of evoke what Lewis is feeling or what he's experiencing. You know, that kind of very repetitive, stupid motion of just crossing your hand left to right, left to right, left to right, and with the other side of your brain, you know, daydreaming. Um, I thought that was just a really just brilliant way to tell that story.
yeah, I think it works so well for two reasons. One, because Edith has a connection to the story, like firsthand.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot for her to connect to, a lot for pieces of the puzzle already there. And the other side of it is you're getting this modern medicinal therapist viewpoint. So not only is Edith able to look at it from her standpoint and tell the story, but also through the standpoint of someone that's living inside of Lewis's head as well. So this is not only just one of the most succinct and precise stories as far and most in-depth stories in the game, but it's also that way for the reasons that there's a lot of connections that you're able to make to it just narratively as Edith. So
yeah, and I think telling all these stories from like the beginning, from Molly's story all the way up through these generations, I think Lewis hits so hard because you understand like the weight of all of this kind of history that's behind him, you know, where all of these stories get more and more impactful as you go on because there's this culmination of history. That if you just played Lewis's section on its own, it would still hit pretty hard, but you wouldn't have as full a picture of who this kid is.
yeah, for sure. One more room up.
Yeah. So that's almost everybody. The last one is Edith.
Yeah, I love this. I love this because this is what I was talking about earlier, how the game does, like, it tells other people's stories through other people. And when Edith sits down on this bed and puts her feet up and she reveals, like, probably right before Lewis's story that she was pregnant, and she just kind of relaxes. It takes the time to tell Dawn's story, what happened to her mom. It takes the time to tell the story of why they left the house. The relationship with her and Edie is like heavily expounded on. And you get this, there's a lot of pieces that are connected in this few minutes before you even get to what actually is going on with Edith. And that's primarily how Edith's story is told, is, you know, why they finally left the house and what happened to her mom, who died of a mysterious illness. What they sign post to cancer, but they don't specifically say.
Right.
They don't really give a definitive answer of what happens to Edie either. Old age, suicide, they just kind of.
Yeah. You know. All we know is that when they leave the house, Edie is gone by the next day, is I think the only like indication that we get there.
Yeah. Which could be. I read a theory, and I won't take credit for it. I'm not taking credit for it, but I don't know who said it. I read online that there's a lot of they had mentioned that Edie spent a lot of time. So I think it was whenever you're up near the graveyards and you look out at the house, it had mentioned that Edie said that she had looked out over and saw the house every day. And while the game doesn't give you any indication that this is actually what happened, a lot of people think that she went to the house and tried to go and just died in the ocean with the house, and
I think that's fair.
Essentially being part of what it is. It's pure speculation,
sure.
But it's as good of an ending as, you know, we get from her in any other capacity. So,
well, the small section that we play as Edie is her walking out to the old house at low tide, which is the only story that is like fully complete.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I saw again, I don't remember who said it, but also read it on the internet. Um, because like when you're reading Edie's story, um, because you're experiencing it as Edith, like her recollection of it, when she's interrupted and her mom grabs the book from her, the words on the page just stop because that's all she remembers is what she was able to read. Um, I thought that was a really nice detail. Like in this memory, there isn't any more that's written in that book. Like the words just cut out in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah. No, every, in the truest sense of the word narrative, like as the narrative is physically written in this game, the placement, how they fall apart, how they move, where they are, it's all very intentional, and it all has its own sense of impact at every step. So yeah, it's a great point. I'm glad you pointed that out. I like where her room is. Not only have we discussed that it's at the top of this metaphorical tree or this house, but what I like about where it's placed is there's a vantage point to look out over the rest of the house. Mm-hmm. And it gives this idea that as I was playing this, that Edith has the ability to look back at the past and grow from her mistakes, or look out over everything that's come before her. And the fact that she sits down and is cataloging her experiences here, and really has a sense of like true growth in this final like moment is really it's really tough to come to grips with, especially when you realize that she's cataloging this for the sake of her son. Mm-hmm. So I just thought that was a really good touch here. And I don't exactly know how to transition to the final like scene here, because honestly it felt pretty abrupt to me. Mm. And I know that's intentional because that's the whole point of like this, the curse, quote unquote, this whole game's about. It kind of like fades to black, and you're put in this like weird spacey like pink canal type funnel, and there's words floating around that are Edith's words, and you're kind of like putting them together as you're moving towards this, and you figure out pretty quickly that it's signaling childbirth. Yes. The breathing, the heartbeat in the background, that unfortunately comes to an end as we find out that Edith Finch, who you've been playing as this whole time, dies in childbirth, giving birth to what remains of Edith Finch, her son Christopher.
I think so. I'm not sure if that's.
I don't know why that's sticking out in my head, but
yeah. Yeah, and there is kind of at least for me, there was a gut punch with this journal where she has a line where it's like, I'm hoping I can just tell you this stuff, but if you're reading this, it didn't pan out that way.
Yeah, this was one of those moments where I had like my hands on my mouse and I'm like looking at the monitor, and my hand just like fell on my lap, and I was just like sitting there rocking in my chair back and forth, like, yeah, like I said I would come back to this, and I've talked about this again, this idea that each person, Edith's child, you, and Edith are all part of this like triangle. That as you move closer, as two sides move closer to, or move up their respective scale, they're both moving away from something and towards another. And this scale is like constantly shifting as you're playing this game. You get closer to Edith, you're getting further away from like the child aspect. And then once you find out there's a child, you start to move closer to that. And then, her and Edith move together. And it's, I thought about that like constantly while I've been thinking about this game. And the reason I like it so much is because you never connect with that child. Like it's mentioned and it's done in the game, the credits roll, and you're left to wonder like,
Yeah.
why did I just experience this story? Like what, not like what was the point? Cause like the point is pretty signposted, but I think that the question that we're trying to answer by reviewing this game and talking about it is what the game is ultimately driving at. That is what the question the game wants you to answer.
Yeah. When we talk, like, I think the curse, if we move past the idea of seeing it as something that is supernatural and see it more as something that is self sustaining and kind of brought on by how the Finch family views themselves, it begins to take on a lot of different meanings, whether or not that's there are elements of mental illness or like genetic factors, maybe, but it's more about like trauma, intergenerational trauma, and how you process that. Where the Finches are an entire family that has lived for generations with like concrete proof that they are doomed to an early death. And what does that do to you? You know, and expand that out. And I think really what I think one of the big things that this game is about is like, how much are you impacted by the beliefs and like stories from people that you haven't met, like from generations back? How much of them impacts you directly in a very like linear fashion. One of the like, it's not quite a gut punch, but it is one of those like, oh fucking, Edith's son already, like, he's already got a cast on by the end of this game. Like the only thing we see of him is like, there's some sort of harm coming to this kid, probably. Mm-hmm. Edith is passing on an entire history to her son. And that is a lot, it's a huge boon to him to understand where his family comes from. And it also means accepting a whole bunch of this like weight that they've all had to carry up until this point. The game ends, I think you're right, pretty ambiguously for Christopher. And I'm not, it doesn't doom him in any way, but it also doesn't say like, well, now that we've sorted through all this shit, he's absolved of it, Like it ends very open-ended, which I thought was well done.
Yeah, it's interesting because like the way that I kind of perceived this idea of like this, the whole game focuses on Edith cataloging her family's experiences and returning to this house in a way so that way she could tell the story and let someone else make the decision for themselves. She said she was getting these stories to pass them on, whether or not she was going to be around to tell them or whether or not they'd be cataloged. Either way, her child would hear these stories.
Right.
And what I thought was interesting about this is if you look at Odin and Ingeborg, all the previous generations, you have Edie, who lived a very, very long life, had a family that had kids, that had grandkids, all of her kids, like even though Walter had like a terrible thing happen to him, he lived till he was over 50 years old. Sam lived till he was 30. Calvin, and Barbara both died pretty young, and Molly died pretty young. But Edie had the ability for those people to tell the stories of the generations before them to Walter and to Sam, and they had the ability to pass that on to Dawn, who had the ability to pass that on to Edith. And so what I think it goes kind of toe in toe with what you were just saying is that if you're armed with the knowledge of what came before you and you don't look at it as a curse or generational trauma or something, it's about how you perceive the stories that are there. And I think what the story is about is how Edith was able to digest these and tell not a cautionary tale or not a what not to do, or not why our family is cursed, but told the experience of life of each one of those people that came before them. They didn't all focus, they all had death in them and trauma in them, but they all focused on the beauty in the life. They talked about how Sam was a great dad and was doing things with them. Talked about Calvin, how he experienced the world and in a sense of wonder, and how Walter was focused on just being as dedicated to his routine and wanted to get out and experience the world. All of these stories are told in a sense of personality and wonder and experience, as opposed to being cautionary tales of what you should and shouldn't do and to avoid the family. So if you look at it in the sense of the generational storytelling, the branches that last the longest perpetuate the information that's passed down. Edie had the best relationship with Sam, who had the who also, each of them had their own trauma, but had the best relationship narratively with Dawn, who had the best relationship narrative with Edith. And the way that they told those stories and the love that was shared down the family tree is what causes it to persist. So by Edith cataloging this story and telling every family's events from a place of love, and even the ones that didn't last, almost 70, 80 years ago, telling their stories from a place of curiosity and love and respect. The idea was that whether or not the curse was real, Edith was out to break that cycle and thought it could be told from a place of reverence to the past and not as a fear for what could potentially come back from it.
Mm-hmm. So one caveat here is that Dawn actively tries to hold these stories. The reason that we're here is that Edith didn't hear any of these stories from Dawn. Dawn actively tries to hold back this kind of history from Edith, and this game is her trying to sort of reclaim that in some way. These aren't stories that Edith knew growing up.
Yeah, I guess that's true, and maybe that would be up to the point that Edith was looking to try to break that cycle,
or at least understand. She doesn't understand that there's a cycle. I don't think, because she doesn't know even how Molly died. She obviously she knows how her brothers died, but there's a lot.
Well, she knows that they died young.
Yeah, that's true.
She knows
there's a whole fucking family graveyard. Never mind.
Yeah. No, she knows that they died young, and I guess you're right. I mean, that perspective would need tweaked to a degree because of how sheltered her opinions of that were. Mm-hmm. But the fact that she knew that they were being sheltered for a reason, and Edie was trying to get her to open up that door, and almost literally trying to get her to be able to experience those things, and literally gave her a key to be able to to go into those things on her deathbed. Her mother gave it to her, kind of signposted that she did want to open that door to try to, maybe this is the reason this curse finally caught up to me. What I did was wrong, and that's what killed me. Let me open the door to allow you to experience those things and get those stories told, so that way you can experience it for what it truly was and not this curse. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I would have to sit on that a little bit and rethink that hypotheses, but I think that regardless of whether that's what's going on with exactly what Edith is trying to accomplish, I think that that's the point of the narrative, is that do I think the curse is real? No, I don't. I think that obviously there's bad shit that's happened, and it's been pretty detrimental and terrible, and this is horrible luck. But I think that you're right. It's the victim of circumstance is that you had people die in childbirth. You have genetic disorders that can cause a predisposition to that. SIDS and kids being kids in a dangerous island. They reference that this game didn't have to take place on an island. It was meant to be on an isolating place that had its own sense of dangers and isolation that could lead to things like serial killers or, being dashed on the rocks and the waves and storms and things like that. So those were intentional design choices because of the circumstances that could take place. And I'm not saying the curse isn't real, because I think that ultimately it's up to everyone's interpretation of, the events that have taken place. But I think that in my perspective, it's not. It's the curse is meant, it's something that Edith is trying to overcome with the stories and the circumstances of the events by understanding who these people were. It doesn't matter if the curse is real or not, because it's more about who they were and the impact that they have on the people's lives and the generations to come. Because regardless of all of this that's happening, the house keeps getting taller, Finches keep coming into the world, and the curse has not stopped the family from continuing to persist.
That's fair. Yeah. And I don't think it's a literal curse. When you visit the graveyard for the first time, Edith mentions that Edie had the graveyard built before the house, which is like the kind of fucking mindset I think that Edie is put in, And I think that, like you're saying, these are about how, these stories kind of impact people. And that's for better and for worse, I think. And sort of understanding that relationship between how ideas get passed from generation to generation. But yeah, I'll tell you what, I'm going to boot this game up tomorrow. I immediately want to go back through it again.
Yeah, I mean, this is a generational tale, like both literally and like in the sense of like something we don't get the chance to experience in a medium very often.
Like, I would agree with that.
There's so much depth and intrigue and just literal wonder in this that I have come to honestly just expect from something that Annapurna puts out.
Yes.
Just because of how just incredibly talented their team is. I did have a question for you. And this is another one of those things that I just think is a really good topic of discussion. I know that this has been, at this point, our episode is longer than the game is, but
right before we hit record, Michael was like, I don't think this will be a long one.
It's always the long ones when I say that. What
yeah, exactly.
I think it's worth noting that Edith's name is Edith Finch because she's a part of the Finch family.
Hang on.
However,
I'm just confirming that.
The game intentionally signposts that her father's name is Sanjay Kumar.
Mm-hmm.
Why, if she has the ability to be born without the Finch name, why would her mother want her to embrace the Finch name and potentially be bound to the curse?
That's interesting. And there's a weird precedent for this. Because Edie's husband, Sven, also takes on the name Sven Finch. Where it almost feels like, I don't know, that's another example of an idea that's just kind of been passed from generation to generation, where like the Finch name is so important. Dawn absolutely, I think, understands that the curse isn't real, but also has a serious amount of love for her family. And I think carrying that name forward is important to her, especially because she's carrying two dead siblings. Making sure that gets passed on, I can totally understand why it would be something that's important to her. That's something that I hadn't thought about, though, because you're right. Like, Edith Finch, her last name in a traditional sense would be something else. But
yeah, and if like, I don't know. And maybe I'm thinking about this like too much from a modern perspective and digging too deep into it. But like throughout like the ending of the game, as I was looking back over some of the notes and other things that I read on it, Sanjay marries Dawn. They have these 3 kids. Like none of them, all of them wanted to take on the Finch name, and that was the. I just wish they would have like touched on that, something like, my mom wanted to make sure that we all stuck to our heritage, but like Dawn was also like really intent on like leaving it in the past. Like so
for a while, but she's also the one who comes back to the house, like,
right, but only after her husband dies and she has nothing to turn to.
Yeah, that's
like
fair.
it took a trauma to get her to come back, so like all the decisions that she made regarding her kids were all obviously decided upon before
Yeah, that's a good point.
Demise. So I just wish there had been a little bit more there as to why the name Finch persisted. Other than just narratively it needed to,
Yeah.
And maybe they legitimately just overlooked that, and that's totally fair. This game is so rich that I would be willing to be like, yeah, that's totally fine. Like I get it. But
yeah.
I'm sure there's a Reddit thread out there I could dig up that answers the question for me.
You could say that about anything, though.
Exactly.
Like when
that's my cop-out answer.
When we were arguing earlier about what's the best Sonic Rule 34 comic, and like, I bet there's a Reddit thread we could look at. Sorry.
Way to expose us, Max.
You're right. That was right before I hit record.
Oh man. I don't even have like any last thought. We talk about Milton.
Oh yeah. Oh, please.
So there's like the ending of the game, and Milton is never discussed again. The game firmly wants you to forget that Milton has existed. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of like, when I was looking up some things about this game, there are people out there that say that Milton is the last remaining Finch. And that was what Remains of Edith Finch, was her brother. And it's an interesting take because no one's able to really dig into it that much or give much context because, in my opinion, it's ludicrous. Right. However, Annapurna has created this universe that allows Milton to persist as the king in the game, The Unfinished Swan. Now, I have never played this game. Have you played Unfinished Swan?
I haven't. It was just today that I learned that it was a tie-in to What Remains of Edith Finch.
Gotcha. Yeah. I like literally finished the game, and after like a couple hours of like sulking and crying, I Googled like, okay, what happened with Milton, expecting there to be some like subtle answer in the game that I missed somewhere. And sure enough, Milton, according to the narrative, was able to escape this reality and move on. At least until he meets his demise as the king and the Unfinished Swan.
That is wild shit.
Yeah. Now, I think this is just a continuity of some of the things that we've already touched on. How, people are able to, escape or create their own realities, live in their own worlds. We talked about that a lot with Lewis, and I don't really think this is any different. I think this is it's a continuation of another story in which they were able to tell. It's very Annapurna to be able to take this outside of the realms of just the story of what's happening in front of Edith Finch, letting us know that there are some things, there are mysteries that Edith isn't going to be able to solve about her family. And if she ever were to solve them, they would be outside the realm of her understanding, and she wouldn't be able to fully grasp exactly what took place. Yeah.
It's hard for me to judge how I feel about this because, again, haven't played the game. Interested in it, though. This feels almost, to tie it back to another game that we've covered, this feels kind of like the true ending of like Death's Door, how it ties back into Titan Souls.
Mm-hmm.
Can this further your understanding of the game? Yes, but if you don't want to consider it like fully canon, I think that's totally okay because the core game itself holds up as a complete narrative. Um, I don't know much about the Unfinished Swan, but it seems like it's a much more surreal game uh, than Edith Finch is. So TBD on this one. I would like to revisit this, like, if you and I have a chance to like pick it up and play it at some point, because
we've set a precedence for retrospects on the show. So
that's true.
There's always the option to come back and discuss this at the end of the year. So
I think that would be great. But yeah, I as I was writing up my notes for this, because one of the things we think about is like expandability. Is there an option for like DLC? And what I put was like probably not, my guy. But now I guess that this kind of complicates things, doesn't it?
If there is, I'm not playing it. Oh man. No, I mean, and in terms of, I said this already, I won't belabor the point, but just if you haven't played the game, play it. In terms of like, it's not often a game can capture like raw emotion like this game does and turn it into a narrative device that furthers multiple different elements that can really like drive points home, hit on multiple different fronts, and really tell just a really comprehensive story that can that you can learn and grow from. And I really like that about this game. So
yeah,
just an absolute killer. Like it gut wrenched me for a good bit, and pretty sure that's what I said. Like as soon as I finished it, I messaged you. I was like, "Wow, I'm gonna go cry for like 2 hours."
Well, I am dead.
Well, I'm dead inside, even more than I was before. Barring some insensitive jokes about, throwing ourselves on rocks in the ocean and Gregory being an incel, whatever.
Yeah, and also speed running this game, which I think would be how quickly can you go through the 5 stages of grief?
Oh man. Yeah, we talked about that. If you are speed running Edith Finch, you have a problem.
Yeah,
seek help and therapy now.
You need to find another game, man.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
Well, apparently my watch thinks I'm talking to it. So I think that's going to be a good place.
Yeah, that's a great way to wrap it up, Mike.
Yeah. So I can't thank you enough for recommending this game. Like, I would not have played this likely if you hadn't have just told me, "Hey, let's do this for PGC. I think you're going to like it."
Yeah, I had a feeling that this would make for a good discussion. I had no idea that it would make for this good of a discussion, and I really gotta just give it up to you for that. This is one that I was really excited to talk about because I think the story is so open to a lot of interpretation and so like creatively rich. I really gotta thank you because this has been great and opened me up to a lot of different ways of looking at this game now, which is why I'm very excited to immediately replay it.
Yeah, I've already decided I'm gonna jump in again. I said at the beginning of this, the best way to experience this is twice back to back. So, no, I agree. I mean, this is a good experience, and I'm excited to like dig into just more of things like this because like, whenever we put this show together, we talked about a little bit ago, we're not going to do things that we don't enjoy. And what I like about things when we talk about like games like Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space, they're games that are just really fun and visceral and exciting. But like games like this, like get my juices flowing. Like this is what games were designed to do. Like I've said it multiple times in the last few years. I think video games are one of the most intense form of art and I think that they're like, I think it is abused by shit like live service and stuff like that. And I think that Annapurna is a studio that is just doing it right. And I'm not saying you can't enjoy things for what they are, go do, but as far as like, this is what I need in the video game space. Games like this, like reset you, and get you looking for things. Like immediately after I finished this game, like a couple hours later, I went and bought Journey because I've also never played that, and I'm like, well, I need another gut wrenching tale that I could weep through. So I've heard this is a good one.
Yeah, and if you've made it to this point and you're immediately like, if you've played this or you're looking for things like this, Firewatch is another incredible game that I think we may end up talking about at some point. If this is something that really resonated with you, I could see that hitting pretty hard as well.
Okay. I mean, I don't have any reason not to go check that out. So, but Max, it is late for us, and it is. It's been a long time. We hope that you guys have enjoyed the return to form with a blissful, nearly 3-hour episode. And I really hope that you give the episode a chance. Obviously, you're getting to this point. You have, but like this was a absolute joy to experience in so many ways, and to discuss it. Like we already talked about how much fun we've had discussing it. But it's just brought this game to life in like new ways that I didn't think were going to be possible, even after having just had like the experience of a lifetime with it. So, thank you for that. And thank you for everyone who, listened to this. It is cool to be able to tell the stories that these games have and discuss them like this. And thank you to Max for being able to, bring that avenue, forward with me. So, wouldn't be post game content without you. That being said, not to belabor anyone with closings and whatnot, but if you're liking this show, we would. It's been a while since we've had an episode out. The algorithms are weighing on us. If you could do us a favor and leave us a review for the show, that would be super sick. That helps us out a lot in terms of getting the content out there, especially when it comes to like not just getting our show out there, but like these are conversations. We started this podcast because at least for me, conversations like this are not easily accessible in the video game space. It's a lot of like reviews, or people don't jump like really deep into the stories, or they don't really discuss like the true what the games mean nowadays. And I'm proud to be able to try to do that and put that out there. And if it can help other people play these games, like when someone tells me that they've tried Sekiro for the first time because of how awesome it was to listen to us talk about it, like that's what I'm here for.
Absolutely.
So
that's really what the podcast is built on, is trying to get people to experience Sekiro. That's the core message of every episode.
It will come as no surprise to anyone that all of our highest rated episodes are the From Software episodes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if you're here for the From Software content, there's an episode coming up that's From Software related that you are going to love. Oh boy. But I'll keep that under wraps for now. That being said, I've one more caveat on that point. I don't stress leaving us a review for the sake of helping our show grow. If our show grows from you leaving a review and it brings these games to light to more people, that's what I'm here for. Like that's what I want. So if you listen to this and you have like a viewpoint, if I'm missing something with this game, like I'm hungry for it, please join the Discord and tell us, because like that again is what I'm here for. I want to learn and grow and just continue to feed off of these games and everything that they have to offer. So I'd love some viewpoints that you have on it. So any other words about the game, Max? Anything else you want to cover this evening?
At the moment I've seen what Remains of Edith Finch described as the greatest game you've never played. I would really like to change that title. And if this episode helps move that needle a little bit, if you're the kind of person who's listened to our episodes and start to understand the sort of games that really resonate with Michael and I, and you're in that same sort of wheelhouse, this is a no-brainer for you. It really, really is. I can't stress that enough.
Yeah, I agree. I won't add anything to that because I was very succinct. So, well, hopefully it won't be another 3 months till we come back with another episode. Max isn't going to get married again anytime soon.
Let's cross our fingers.
If he, you know what? Anytime there's a delay, I'm going to say it's because you got married. So no one's going to know whether you're married or not. No one's going to know when the real date was. Sorry, we were out again, folks. Max got married again.
I'm just addicted to it at this point. Oh,
or you're Mormon. Who knows? We don't know.
And you'll never know.
Oh, man. Well, you know what, Max? Why don't you give us your nice, succinct, sweet post-game content sign-off?
Tears of the Kingdom is mid as fuck. Good night, everybody.